Hey guys, so for today's video series, we're going to look at the idea of stereotype and are stereotypes actually harmful? And we're going to try and look at some actual attempts by social scientists to study the idea of stereotype or negative stereotype and see if it actually affects people's behavior and their success in life. So the first video you're going to see has to do with a thing called Stereotype Threat. And you're going to hear from a guy named Claude Steele. Claude Steele is best known for a book called Whistling Vivaldi, where he sort of like lays out all of his research and all of his findings that he and his graduate assistants have done about stereotype threat. He'll explain what that is, but basically in a short form, stereotype threat is where if you know you're in a situation where stereotypically you're not supposed to succeed, or you believe you're not supposed to succeed, it can negatively impact your performance on a task. He'll tell you an example that they used in his lab where they give female math and science majors at college a math test. When he was doing the research, there's a stereotype or a sort of held belief or internalized belief that women in STEM aren't as successful as men. And so these women who are studying STEM fields actually performed worse on the math test if they were, given just a standard exam. They also found, and this is something I don't think comes up in the video, but he does write about in his book. They found that if you make a test taker check a box of like what gender they are before they start taking the test, if they have to check a bubble saying, am I male or am I female, women actually perform worse than even the baseline because Steele argues they're being subconsciously reminded of their female identity. Okay. The same, weirdly enough, is true for if you have white college students and black college students and you have them do an obstacle course or some kind of physical task and you tell them beforehand, this is a test of your innate athletic ability. Turns out that white students perform worse than they would otherwise on that obstacle course because they have this internalized belief that, you may have heard the saying, white men can't jump. Which was the title of a movie that came out in the 90s, but that they believe that they'll do worse on the obstacle course because, of stereotypes about whites being less athletic. But weirdly enough, if you tell people before they take a math test or before they do the obstacle course, you may have heard that women do worse on standardized math tests, but this test is exactly perfect. And exactly standardized so that women and men always perform, the same in a vacuum. It actually helps alleviate the stereotype threat. Another way that you can fight stereotype threat that isn't in the video is that if you are just simply aware that something like stereotype threat exists, you can maybe recognize it and send positive messages to yourself to sort of pump yourself up. Like, okay, I'm feeling a little nervous right now taking this test, but how much of this is really just me feeling, a little bit of test anxiety because of signals that I've soaked up that I'm not smart enough, or that because of this characteristic I can't do it. That doesn't exist. It's kept in my mind, and you can almost put it away. So simply knowing that stereotype threat is a thing actually can help you overcome stereotype threat. So congratulations, you now are one step closer in fighting this battle. You may be wondering where the name of the book Whistling Vivaldi comes from, by the way. It's because when Claude Steele was at the University of Chicago, he met a young black man who was going to a predominantly white school, U Chicago, and he would walk around the campus and he would notice that people would like treat him differently, as though he was, threatening, especially if he wasn't wearing any like U Chicago hoodies or anything like that. If he was just in regular street clothes, they might be a little apprehensive around him, or there might be this idea like, what are you doing on our campus? You may not belong here. And so the strategy that this guy developed to sort of put people at ease is he would start to whistle classical music, especially violin concertos by this guy Vivaldi. And by whistling classical music, he was like sending out a signifier like, I'm not dangerous to you. I'm actually a college student. And so the identity of college student starts to override the identity of like, other or, scary guy or whatever, not a college student. And so that's where the title of the book comes from. Now, is it sad that he has to whistle Vivaldi in the first place to be accepted? Sure. But it made Steele think about, like, if people are doing this to sort of like pass, right, or sort of change the way they're perceived, how much does that affect you if you're just trying to go about your daily life and you're constantly aware of being perceived as Black, Asian, male, female, whatever you decide. Because for a stereotype threat to exist, all there really has to be for there to be a threat is for you to, have been exposed to the stereotype yourself. So if you kind of believe it, it's there. This idea of how you're perceived ties into a quote that I'd like to share with you from a guy named W.E.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois was very talented intellectual, co-founder of the NAACP. He was the first Black man to get a graduate degree from Harvard. I'm pretty sure that's right. But he wrote a book called The Souls of Black Folk in right around 1900 or so. And he came up with this concept of what he calls double consciousness. And I'm going to read you that quote now. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Heavy concept, but what Du Bois is basically saying is that for a Black man in America, or really a Black person in America, he's always aware of being perceived as both Black and American. You're never going to be fully mainstream American because there's this thing that's kind of holding you back, or that people are going to notice about you. And I want to really drill in on this idea of you always feel your two-ness. You're always aware that you're measured by the tape of an outside world. The same way that this kid who walks through the street whistling Vivaldi is aware that people see him both as a Black man and as a college student, and he can put different identities at the forefront, syncs right up with what Du Bois is saying about measuring yourself by the tape of the outside world. That whatever society kind of puts on you, it sticks a little bit. You always kind of feel fractured or torn asunder. That's his idea. And this idea of being perceived, as other or being perceived differently because of race actually was a huge part of the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case, which you might remember is the case that desegregated American schools in 1954, even though it took a long time for Southern schools to actually desegregate. But as part of that case, two sociologists named Kenneth and Mamie Clark were kind of called upon to include their research in the court brief that Thurgood Marshall, who was the lawyer representing Linda Brown's family and these other families, the Kenneth and Mamie Clark were called upon to include their research for something that was called the Dahl test. And this was actually research they'd done like maybe 10 years before the actual Brown Supreme Court decision. But they had come up with this sociological experiment where they would show children a Black doll, baby doll, and a white baby doll. And they'd put them on the table and they would ask the kids questions like, which doll is the nice doll? And they'd ask the kids to pick, which doll is the good doll? They'd ask them to pick. Which doll is the mean doll? They'd ask them to pick. Which doll do adults treat better? They'd ask them to pick. And then at the end, they would ask, which doll looks the most like you? And so they did this test with Black kids and white kids. And what they found was basically that Black children had internalized a bunch of negative ideas about Blackness. If you ask them what doll is the pretty doll, they'll point at the white one. If you ask which doll is the ugly doll, they'll point at the Black one. And this wasn't true in all cases, but it was true in the majority of cases. And this was both horrifying to, folks who were involved in the early civil rights movement, but also, they thought, really highlighted why it was important for schools to be integrated. But they said because, Black children know that they're not able to access this white world, they start to believe that they don't think it's because of white racism. They think it's because there's something wrong with them. They feel their Blackness and they feel as though it's a negative trait. And what's really stark is that when you ask some of these black children in the Kenneth Clark and Mamie Clark doll test, which doll do you look like? A lot of black kids are pointing at the white doll, basically saying that they feel inside white, or that they're trying to be white. You know, it's a bit complicated, but basically, you know, what people take is like, wow, we've made a whole generation and generations upon generations of African American children hate themselves, hate their skin color, right? And what does that do? And we think again about stereotype threat. If you have a negative stereotype, even in your subconscious mind, it's going to affect your ability to perform in school. It's going to affect your ability, you know, to merge through society on the street. And so, what the Brown v. Board lawyers, Thurgood Marshall and others, saw was a chance to prove, with this doll test in their testimony, to prove that black kids were suffering feelings of inferiority because of school segregation. And to overcome this and to help those kids have a better life, schools needed to be integrated. You even see this sort of carried through in Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, where King sort of borrows this idea of you know, internalized racism for black children. In his passage, you might remember this part. You suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness towards white people, when you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, "Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean?" So this idea of clouds of inferiority forming in a child's mental sky is such a eloquent expression of what the doll test really makes people think about. And so this desegregation movement is predicated on the idea that equal access to facilities, equal access to education will make black children feel as though they have a seat at the table. You'll see some videos that have to do with the Kenneth and Mamie Clark doll test. You'll also see a couple clips of a CNN segment where they tried to actually update the doll test for, you know, I think it was 2012, if they did it again to see if there had been any shift in racial attitudes among kids of different ages. Some as young as 4 or 5 years old, some as old as 7th or 8th grade. So you'll get to watch those below. You'll also get to see a video about what's called the Jane Elliott eye experiment. And this is basically, Jane Elliott was a school teacher in Iowa who taught a predominantly white class. And after Martin Luther King was assassinated, killed in 1968, one of the kids came into her classroom and said, "Mrs. Elliott, I heard that they shot a king last night. You know, what country was he from?" or something like that. You know, who was the king? And so she was like amazed that her, you know, I think she taught 3rd grade, that these kids hadn't heard of Martin Luther King, but they're living in Iowa in a like 99% white town. She is kind of an educator that's kind of progressive and committed to social justice in a way, and like diversity training way before it was in vogue. And so she concocts this experiment. She's like, these kids, these, you know, little kids from Iowa have never felt like they don't belong, or never felt prejudice, and they never felt what it feels like to be discriminated against because they look like everybody else in their town. So she concocts this experiment where she's going to segregate her class based on the color of their eyes. You may have heard of this. And so she, you know, separates them out, and she makes whatever, you know, blue eyes and brown eyes. And she makes whatever the out group is that day, wear these like collars around their necks that sort of signify that they're, you know, the outside group. And, you know, the kids who have the collars on don't have certain privileges. They have to be in the back of the line. When they go to lunch, they can't drink from the water fountain. They have to use these like little cups or something. You know, you'll see it in the video. But so she creates an atmosphere where discrimination is sort of built into the system. And what she finds is not only do kids start treating each other badly based on their eye color, which they weren't doing the day before, right? So it's something manufactured. She also finds that they're worse at performing academic exercises if they're in the out group, because they're feeling almost like oppressed by the wearing the collar, or by being blue-eyed or brown-eyed, whatever day it is that you're out. And so one scene you'll see is they're doing little flashcards in a pack. It might be math or phonics, I'm not sure. But she times them to see how fast they can get through the card pack. And she finds out that when they have the collars on, they're like way slower than the same group of kids is the next day when they don't have the collars on. So this is kind of maybe, again, validation of the idea of stereotype threat, or at least a validation of the idea that if you feel outside, if you feel oppressed, or if you feel as though you don't belong, you perform worse in various tasks. And then the last thing we'll look at is an example of where this study has kind of moved now. Claude Steele's still, I think, doing work on stereotype threat. That's relatively new research. But one other newish field of research comes out of, I think it's out of Harvard, but some other places as well. Some social psychologists there have come up with a thing called the Implicit Association Test, or the IAT. And what this is supposed to try to do is measure implicit biases that we have about really anything. It started out as black versus white. Do we have internalized preferences for white people over black people over white people? But now it's expanded to cover all kinds of identities, men versus women, guns versus like not guns. Do we have prejudices against gun owners? Do we have prejudice, or do we have preferences when it comes to like issues of like skinny versus like fat? I mean, all of this stuff. And so the research keeps growing and growing. And the way they do this is they put pictures up on the screen, and you have to sort them with your keyboard to kind of be like, oh, that's a white face, that's a black face. And then they'll flash up adjectives, like some of them are positive, like good or nice, and some of them are negative, like evil or dangerous. And you have to sort the good and the bad. And the idea is that if they show you a black face and then they show you like an adjective like evil, and you're really fast at sorting those two together, that you have like a bin for evil, and a bin for black, then it's like the idea was already in your head if you respond like the fractions of a second faster. This is all based on like very, very small intervals of time. And so it tries to measure whether you have a slight automatic preference for one group over the other. This test has been criticized pretty heavily by some folks in the scientific community. The developers of the test have come out and said, well, it's not really meant to be predictive on an individual basis, meaning if you take it and you get a result that says you have an overwhelming preference for black people over white people, it doesn't necessarily mean that's true. And it just is measuring your like subconscious. It's not measuring how you treat everyday people. You might be perfectly egalitarian in your everyday actions, but sometimes things get in your mind, and the test purports to measure that. They say the test works better if you take it in the aggregate, meaning like over a very large sample size of everyone who takes the test. They see certain trends that they're able to sort of look at, and that's what they're really concerned with as social psychologists, is to see where the society at large is at. Who knows? But this idea of implicit bias is now pretty commonly discussed in corporate settings too. The idea of like in hiring practices, could subconscious bias against black candidates or other candidates of color or female candidates affect the hiring process? Again, there's a conversation about this. Some people have even done research to show that even if you like have an office undergo bias, anti-bias training or diversity training, it actually makes people's biases get worse, because I don't know why. Maybe it makes people think about like themselves as an identity rather than a person. Maybe it's sort of because people are kind of defensive. It's a very tricky thing to talk about. Because people get defensive, they maybe like cling on to their own identity even harder. I'm not sure. But this is like right on the cusp of where science and sociology and behavior is intersecting. So I want you to be aware that it exists more than anything else, because these are conversations that will continue on, and that will continue to be more and more of the discourse as you guys grow up. If you're curious about the IAT, or you're not quite sure what it is and you want to try to take it yourself, you actually can. It's still online, and you can take it through Harvard's IAT lab. I am not going to require you to take it by any means, and I want to caution you, don't take the results too seriously. you know, and don't let them shake you up. But if you want to just sort of see what the test is like, you can go visit their website and get a feel for what they offer. One thing that is true about the IAT that's been part of some of the criticism around it is that if you take the test multiple times, like sometimes it should theoretically give you the same result each time. It should be repeatable. The IAT is oftentimes kind of repeatable, but sometimes you get really widely different findings. I've taken it 3 times now just to see kind of what I get, and I've gotten the same thing all 3 times, which is like pretty much, you know, neutral preference, which, you know, that makes me happy. But your mileage may vary, right? So take it at your own risk, but and be aware that you can actually go and look at it yourself. This is an active scientific endeavor that they're working on at Harvard. Again, I never purport to give you anything except just what facts I found. I'll leave it to you to find your own conclusions and find out what you think. And I always try to cite my sources when I can. So you'll see the videos below. Check them out. That's where some of this is coming from. If you want more readings, I can gladly provide them for you. But happy watching, you guys. Thank you.